My name is Kendra Gates DeRusso, and I am the country director with World Vision Vanuatu. And we have a grant under the Water for Women Fund that has been specifically focusing on disability inclusion. And so it is a real pleasure to be here with you today to speak about that. I'm waiting for my colleague, Lana Wolf, to join me on the stage, and I'll ask her to introduce herself as well. Today's session is about sharing the power and how we can progress inclusion of marginalized people in WASH through never being neutral. So it's not enough just to say you're working towards inclusion. You must always be actively supporting inclusion and calling out exclusion. So today, World Vision Australia, World Vision Vanuatu, and EdgeEffect have partnered with Water for Women Fund and Australian Aid to speak about how many development actors have found that barriers in terms of access to WASH have been exaggerated and compounded as an effect of COVID-19. And so we're going to be focusing on today how as development practitioners, we must never be neutral when it comes to inclusion of SGM people and people with disability, and how we can use these really extraordinary times to shift power, because that's when change happens. I can see that my colleague Lana has joined us on stage. Lana, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm the person that is having IT troubles. I apologize. My name is Lana Wolf, and I'm a founding co-director of EdgeEffect. We focus on the inclusion of sexual and gender minorities in humanitarian and development contexts, and we have a lot of work and a lot of interest in WASH and we work with the Water for Women Fund as well as with some of the organisations.
So just a very quick overview of the workshop proceedings today. We'll spend about 25 minutes going through a framework of inclusion that Lana has really taken the lead on and has been very inspirational to me personally as I've gotten to know her through planning this workshop. We'll then take a bit of time to transition to our individual tables, where there will be a convener at each table that will take you through a case study developed by 6 different organizations. And then there'll be about 35 minutes to be able to discuss that together. And then at the end, we'll all come back to this plenary presentation view and just have a bit of chat box and learning discussion about each individual case study. And then we'll have some closing remarks and hopefully some great learnings.
Inclusion happens at many levels. Sometimes it happens when we do work around organisational policy and organisational cultural choices. Sometimes it's about project design, about implementation, about monitoring, learning and evaluation. A little bit later, we'll be exploring some of the Water for Women Fund examples of inclusion, specifically with sexual and gender minorities or people with disabilities. But firstly, we need to kind of know, how do we actively work inclusively? And we'll be looking at inclusion at a project implementation level using some frameworks. But firstly, I guess the understanding of why we said that neutrality is really important, about not being neutral. And neutral in this instance, or neutrality, has quite a few different meanings, and everybody takes on their own perception of what that meaning is. But one meaning is that it's an impartial or unbiased state or person. That sounds pretty good. You know, we don't want to be biased against another person, and that's the whole point of inclusion. But sometimes when we think about impartiality, it's usually being understood as not for, but not against. We need to think about what does that mean for people who experience pre-emergency marginalizations? What does that mean for people that are being left behind? And if we're working towards a place where we don't want them to be left behind, we need to take on a more active stance. And that's really why we think neutrality is important, and how do we take that active stand. So 1 billion people, or about 15% of the world's population, experience some form of disability, and disability prevalence is higher for developing countries. 1/5 of the estimated global total, or between about 110 and 190 million people, experience significant disabilities. Now, there are some examples that prove this isn't exclusive, but of course, people with disabilities have experienced wide-reaching impacts across the globe. And we will be seeing some examples of how that's not the case. For example, with, not that it's not the case, but we'll be seeing examples of what it means, for example, to take the opportunity to see what disability inclusion can look like and what can happen when COVID isn't in your country. So, for example, with Vanuatu. But we'll also be thinking about and looking at case studies that show what people with disabilities can do and how they have been uniquely impacted by the pandemic and what's been happening throughout COVID-19 to be more inclusive of people with disabilities. And of course, we'll be looking at sexual and gender minorities. Generally speaking, during the COVID crisis, the pre-existing challenges faced by sexual and gender minorities have been exacerbated by the entrenched legal, social and economic inequalities. So what does that mean during the time of COVID, and what kind of ways have people been more inclusive? One way that we can think about how we could be more inclusive and really be practical and really take active steps is by looking at inclusion frameworks. And inclusion frameworks are ones that help guide us to have a much more practical, inclusive activities and practice within our organisations. Next slide, please. An example is the continuum of approaches of action in gender and health. So I find them really useful, and I use it as a guide to guide my work as an inclusion specialist. And we've developed our own framework for inclusion, and lots of people have saying yes, 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 seen but yet to apply. Well, you're going to see another one now. This is an example of one of the ones that we have developed. And I will be using it more extensively today, and we'll quickly look at project design as one way to do that, but also acknowledging that I've done it in a way that thinks about disability inclusion and other marginalised groups as well. And that next slide is an example of how we might think about a socio-ecological framework. And we've really tried to do that today in the way that we've thought about what kind of case studies shall we be sharing or asking organisations to share with us. Where do they sit? Do they sit at a grassroots level? Do they sit within staff and organisational culture? Does it sit with policy and programming? Does it sit with developing relationships with CSOs and DPOs, for example? And so if we think about EdgeFX diverse, so if we think about all of this inclusion, if we can go to the next slide, please, and we think about EdgeFX diverse SOGS inclusion continuum, we can look at examples of inclusion from a project's perspective. It's good to note that the continuum can be used to consider projects from a policy level, an organisational level, a research or project design level, an implementation level, a delivery level, and even co-designing, monitoring, learning and evaluation. And so in this spectrum, if we think about inclusion, if we think about it being exploitative, for example, projects are implemented in such a way as that community members realise they're unwelcome and may be faced with hostility. And that could be because there's hostility in the community for those people. It could be that it's a workshop at the top of stairs and it's not inviting and friendly to people who, you know, have mobility issues, or it might not be a safe space for SGM people. You know, if we think about it being aware, we think about it being in terms of consultation, but how often does that genuinely happen? If we're thinking about it in an accommodating sense, projects are implemented in consultation with organisations and communities. And then if it's transformative, projects are implemented in partnership with LGBT CSOs and DPOs and their communities. But the thing is that this isn't a surface level tick box situation where we go, yes, we've done the consulting. You know, if we really want to be inclusive, we start to think about where is the power held. For example, with exploitative and unaware, by the project manager and their team. For aware, mostly by the project management and team. And accommodating might be some power shared outside of the project team, usually in participatory activities. However, the power to make key decisions is mostly with that project team. And transformative power is shared across all stages, from planning, designing, decision-making, evaluation. Diving more deeply, another aspect of inclusion to consider is the different approaches we take to community development or to research or to what the practice is that we're doing within water sanitation and hygiene, and thinking about how they align with both the power and the types of inclusive activities that one may undertake. Is it the professional is the expert? Is it person-centered? Is it a participatory approach? Is it a co-design approach? And is it a co-production approach? But just because we want to be more inclusive, and we can often be more inclusive, doesn't necessarily mean that that's the end point of our decision making. How suitable are these different approaches to the project constraints, whether it be time, finances, resources, skills, and knowledge? And I think that it's really important to acknowledge when particular approaches, when particular types of inclusion are ones to do, but ones to avoid. So with example, aware, you know, if you don't have sufficient time and resources, participation doesn't work well when squashed in a short time frame. In accommodating, when co-designers are likely to be overridden by traditional governments, it's a place to think about, is this really the type of inclusion that we want to do? When there is insufficient time to build capacity and fairly pay co-designers, or if a practitioner doesn't really understand co-design, now's not a time to work. And with transformative, again, if there's a lack of capacity amongst professionals and marginalised CSOs to partner in this way, and there's a lack of capacity to facilitate in this way. And I guess this is a point to say that inclusion is something that's really important, and there's lots of great examples of it happening, but it's really important to remember that it should be happened safely and with the duty of care and in steps. And I think that the case studies show that that is something that's really important, and it goes a really long way. Of all the case studies, they're showing really great examples of going slowly and surely and sustainably in their inclusion, and that's really, really important for long term. Sustainable changes takes a system-wide approach. Yet if you see from the case studies, focusing on one area creates inclusion opportunities for other areas of the organisation or project. And during COVID-19, the Water for Women Fund partners have adapted and worked in different ways for more inclusive outcomes. They've been creative, adaptive, working at different levels of the system, yet achieving great inclusion outcomes. So I want to thank the organisations and the conveners for their case studies, and invite Kendra to again share back and introduce our co-conveners for the case studies. So does anyone have any questions about a continuum or about how we can adapt, I guess, frameworks to think about not only what are the things that we're doing, but also what kinds of power we're taking, what kinds of approaches we're taking.
One of the things that I have, so in World Vision Vanuatu, well, we're one of the case studies at the tables, but I was very, we've gone on a journey of disability inclusion, but Vanuatu is a very sort of traditional culture that does not recognize SGM people and can marginalize them very severely. And one of the things that Lana and I have talked about a lot is how can we safely start the inclusion process? And so these frameworks have helped me a lot to determine what is safe and how can I include the SOGS community without doing further harm. And so this is where the tool has been really helpful for me, and to push my notions of how I can start that journey with my team. Lana, I see that Trevor has asked a question in the chat about what that acronym means.
Yeah, and I will post it in the major chat as well. So that acronym, I apologise for getting my terms mixed up. In the fund, we use the term sexual and gender minorities. As an organisation, EduFet tends to use the term SOGS, which means sexual orientation, gender identity, expression and sex characteristics. It's another term for LGBTIQ+ or sexual and gender minorities. We also have a question from Peter Sherry, who says, do you have any prompts for recognising unconscious exploitative behaviour and attitudes, then moving up to aware and onwards to inclusion? If we think about this in terms of projects, for example, projects might be implemented in such a way that communities recognise they're unwelcome and faced with hostility. So, if we think about that unconsciousness or unconscious bias and how to move up, some of it is around culture and thinking about culture in your organisation. So, for example, I think if you're thinking about disability from an ableist point of view, what are the things that we're making assumptions about that may not be inclusive of people with diverse SOGS, with disability, or with SGM folks? It might be, well, what kind of heteronormative assumptions are we making? What kind of cisnormative assumptions are we making?
So I think a very good concrete example that Lana gave me when we were discussing that one time was one she gave in her presentation initially, which was, holding a workshop that requires steps to access. And you wouldn't necessarily think anything about that if you didn't have a physical impairment that walking up the steps. And so that's why inclusion and participation from people with disability in order to determine even simple things like workshop venue is so fundamental.
Yeah, we've had a few questions about whether it is specific to diverse SOGS. In the way that I've presented and developed it here, it's not. It is with any marginalised groups, although trying to think about specifically diverse SOGS and disability communities. It's about recognising people with diverse profiles, whether that be disability, whether that be SGM. We could think about it in terms of women and thinking about what kind of expectation do we have? What kinds of lived experience do we believe is really important for our project? So if we're thinking about it as we're the experts, then we're thinking about it in a way that marginalises those communities. If we're thinking about them as having something really valid and important to bring to water, sanitation and hygiene, then we think about, well, what is the power level and how can they be involved? So it is something that is more broader than Diverso-GESC. Diverso-GESC is generally where my focus is. However, there's people with Diverso-GESC with disabilities, for example, or people with Diverso-GESC that are women. And so therefore this framework is inclusive of all of those people because intersectionality is a reality.
I can see that we're just about out of time for this part of the session. So Marty, if you could go to the slide that presents the table of case studies. So this is a little brief of the case studies and the different tables that we'll be breaking into. There are 6 case studies that have been submitted by 6 different organizations under the Water for Women Fund. And so World Vision Vanuatu has submitted one on disability inclusion. SNV has submitted one on disability inclusion. I'm reading from my written notes. I'm sorry because my internet connectivity is not fabulous, and so my screen is a little blurry and I can't read the PowerPoint very clearly. IRC has submitted one on SGM inclusion. WaterAid has submitted SGM inclusion, and Plan International in Indonesia has submitted one on disability inclusion, and then CFAR has submitted one on SGM inclusion. And the conveners of each of the tables are listed on the slides as well, and will introduce themselves as we break up into tables. I can see that there are about 46 people in this workshop, and there are 8 places at each table. So we will just use tables 1 through 6. And at table 1, World Vision will be facilitating a case study. At table 2, SNV. At table 3, IRC. At table 4, WaterAid. At table 5, Edge Effect and Plan. And then at table 6, CFAR. And so as we break up into the table groups, Marty, correct me if I'm wrong, people can choose the tables that they would like to join. And if the table fills up, you click into another table. Is that correct?
That's right. Just like a normal in-person event, you can choose. You just click on a chair and you just move to the table that you choose, and you can move at any time.
Great. I'll just repeat which case study is at which table one last time.
I've done it. It's in the chat.
Oh, you're fabulous. Thanks, Lana. Great. Let's pop into table mode then. Hi, everyone. We'll just wait for Lana to join us on the stage. There you are. Hi, Lana.
Hi. I should have turned my lights on earlier. It's getting very late here. How was that, everyone? Do you want to put in the chat box how the case studies were? I saw 1 thumbs up, more thumbs up and clapping. Yay! Like beautiful little balloons. Someone says very engaging, great conversation. Really interesting one from World Vision Vanuatu. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabrielle.
Wow, table 2, such rich discussion. Thanks so much, SNV. We had some questions for you to think about. I'm sure there was lots of rich discussion. We had lots of rich discussion. Did you, Kendra?
Yes, absolutely. It was great, and lots of different questions.
I wonder if the participants can answer some of the questions that we have on the PowerPoint. What ways was inclusion practice, and what steps can you take towards inclusion based on the workshop? And be sure to identify the case studies you're referring to. So if you can just put in the chat box, what ways was inclusion practice. Ravi Kiran says, very interesting. Got a chance to present the case study on SGM representing my community. Great to get insights and perspectives from Lucia and Ronaldo. So Ron Martin says at table 3 IRC, hiring vulnerable and excluded persons to work on staff. So that's how inclusion was practiced with IRC. Their case study was really focusing on hiring, I think that case study was a Hydra person, but someone of diverse gender in IRC to work with their community. Peter says in Vanuatu, changes to inclusive recruitment processes to increase accessibility for disabled folks. Lucia says inclusion was practiced through making SGM visible, through registering them and supporting their self-organisation. Self-organisation is an important one for inclusion. Do you want to join in reading, Kendra?
Sure. Tripti's just put in that as a starting step, speaking to the rights groups to understand the barriers and identify solutions together was a really helpful approach, and it amplifies their voices. And I think that's a really well put nutshell of also of all of the case studies actually, is how starting with consultation is and listening to the voices of the individuals themselves is the most important step. And it is really important to being sensitive to doing no harm, because if you're not a person with a disability or part of the SGM community, you may think you're not doing harm, but you don't actually know until you've checked with people themselves. Pip Robertson from table 2 talked about collaborative long-term partnership with DPOs being mutually beneficial, and that it had become clear that DPOs have become valued WASH experts. And I think the people who were with me on table 1 would recognize that as a theme as well. Ravi and Lucia underscored the need for psychosocial counseling to strengthen self-efficacy of transgendered people. That's from Akila. Lana, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I guess in terms of, firstly, just wanted to reflect on Pip's piece around the importance of it being mutually beneficial, and DPOs have become valued WASH experts. And I think that it is really important to move into a space where we do see people's lived experiences valued expertise. And it's different to some of the technical expertise we have, but they're equally as important. In terms of the psychosocial counselling to strengthen self-efficacy for transgender folks, I think that, you know, in many places the kinds of marginalisation and discrimination that SGM community members face means that there's lots of trauma in communities. Lots of gender-based violence has been experienced, whether it's from random community members, families, or whatnot. And so it is really important when we're working with SGM communities to think about if we need to take a trauma-informed approach to that. The safety and security of the community, not just externally, but feeling safe and comfortable in our services, in our programs, as our colleagues, is really important. Chelsea says, oh, sorry.
Yep, I was just going to say that I think Chelsea's popped in a really interesting question. Maybe if you want to address that one as the last one, and then we can wrap up.
Yeah. Chelsea says, an interesting question from table 4 about SGM inclusion was whether how to frame it to government stakeholders to get their interest, from human rights to WASH and accessibility. Tripti from Nepal suggested universal accessibility was a good enabling way to frame it. Your thoughts are welcome. I think that it is really tricky with government stakeholders, and it really depends on taking a really well-researched and nuanced approach. What are the legal and social restrictions for SGM people? And if it is a safe environment to be working with government with, then I think it depends on the cultural context. In the Pacific, a human rights approach is not always the best approach to take. It's about a community approach and saying, you know, what is really an important aspect of community health and community well-being, and we need to think about all community members being involved in that. For other people, it might be a human rights approach. I think that is a really nuanced cultural context of how you work with communities, about, you know, how are they going to feel the most comfortable to frame it to some degree. Of course, in your own personal world, take a human rights approach. But in terms of how you're communicating it, it is
Lana, I think that's
relevant.
absolutely right. In Vanuatu, we always call it a covert human rights approach. And because of course it's a human rights approach, but that framing generally doesn't hold any weight with the stakeholders that we work with. And so we always frame it as a community cohesion approach, and that gets the most traction.
Yeah, so long-term nurturing relationships with DPOs isn't just, you know, really good practice, but, you know, this is where the expertise comes in. They can tell you what approach it's going to be, how the community responds to different approaches, and what approach is the most appropriate for that community. All you know, unearthed through, you know, strong and stable and mutually beneficial partnerships. Okay, so where are we at now? I've been so nervous this last nearly hour and a half, and we've got 5 minutes left.
It's gone wonderfully. I can see that. Thank you, Kate, for saying that it's been insightful and important, and really grateful for your comments and applause, everyone. Thank you. I think both Lana and I met each other designing this, and so and this platform has certainly been new to both of us as well. So we're really grateful that you've been patient and understanding with us as well.
And a big thank you as well to the co-conveners. They haven't just been co-conveners sharing their passion and their work with you. You know, they've developed their case studies, and they've been developing their case studies because they have been doing the really hard work of inclusion. And so I really, really want to thank the conveners and the other organisations that have been doing an extraordinary job of practicing inclusion, because really that's what Kendra and I really wanted for this, was about thinking about not only, yay, isn't inclusion nice, but how do we practice it?
You know, we really want to challenge you to pop into the chat box or write down on a piece of paper next to you one thing that you will do differently as a result of what you have learned today or discussed. What is one thing that you personally will take away? And I know for me, I now see entry points and feel braver about starting the SGM inclusion journey with my team, because I know how to start without doing harm, which is always what has held me back. And so I feel confident no longer being neutral. So if you feel brave to pop a personal reflection and action into the chat box, please do. And Lana, over to you to close the workshop.
Yeah, so the key takeaway points is that inclusion is a complex set of theories and practices, and there is no one way to do inclusion, but that's really wonderful, isn't it? Because we get to do, you know, what works best for our communities. Different types of inclusion are suitable in different contexts, and however, as Kendra was just saying, that not doing inclusion, you know, can reinforce marginalisation. So we can't be neutral here. We need to share the power, and we need to think about, you know, being able to do that and being able to be more inclusive in our practices. So Peter's takeaway is seek improved understanding of the SGM culture and context in PNG Highlands. Tripti says, my takeaway is gender and inclusion is about leadership vision and taking actions that embed that. So we'll keep pursuing that. Akila says yes to greater practice of inclusion and all the processes it entails, and say no to neutrality. Ron says prioritize inclusion in all projects.
Thank you, everyone, for all of your reflection and for your participation. And I think with that, we'll wish you a good evening or morning. I know there are people all around the world.
Yeah, and a big thank you to the Water for Women Fund for hosting us and having Kendra and I host a workshop.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Marty, for your facilitation as well.